Imagine being so confident you march into the Arctic armed with nothing but optimism, wool socks, and a stunning lack of research. History is basically a scrapbook of people freezing to death while insisting everything's fine, and somehow it only gets dumber from here. 1. Announcing that snow can't be that dangerous. An early Arctic expedition marched into a blizzard, carrying the kind of equipment better suited for a mild picnic in October, proudly dragging along crates of fine china while forgetting things like insulated boots. The leader insisted the men could walk briskly to generate heat, which is the kind of optimism usually found in motivational posters, not subzero wastelands. And within days, half the group had realized that fashion-forward wool capes do not, in fact, repel 40 winds. The official journal politely described their suffering as unexpected environmental resistance, which is a civilized way of saying the Arctic personally slapped the ambition out of them one frostbitten finger at a time. The survivors staggered home with frostbitten egos, proving yet again that confidence is no match for weather capable of freezing tea mid-pour and turning bravado into a crunchy historical footnote. 2. Packing more musical instruments than food, another overconfident expedition believed morale could overpower meteorology, bringing violins, trumpets, and a full drum kit to keep spirits high, as if the polar bears would request encores instead of seeing a buffet. The ship's hold was so crammed with entertainment gear that they left behind essential winter tools, a decision later described by historians as a bold choice, meaning disastrously stupid. The men reportedly performed nightly concerts to distract from the fact that their rations were dwindling and their maps were wildly inaccurate, leading them straight into an ice field large enough to host a disastrous winter music festival. When rescue finally arrived, they were found exhausted, starving, and still trying to tune instruments that had frozen solid, proving once again that enthusiasm is a poor substitute for competence, and that the Arctic is not, under any circumstances, interested in hosting your improvisational jazz retreat. 3. Declaring that compasses were emotionally unnecessary, one expedition chose to navigate by gut instinct alone, as if the Arctic were a friendly suburban neighborhood instead of a sprawling frozen maze with fewer landmarks than the inside of a cloud. The leader confidently pointed toward what he believed was true north, which turned out to be an endless drift that looped them in a circle large enough to qualify as performance art about human futility. Meanwhile, the crew grew increasingly irritated as their commander insisted their wandering was exploratory progress, a phrase that deserved immediate retirement. Weeks later, they realized they'd been unknowingly following their own footprints, frozen perfectly in the snow like a cosmic punchline. By the time a passing whaling ship spotted them, the crew was half mad from cold and frustration, and the leader was still insisting the expedition was on schedule, proving that intuition is an adorable concept until pitted against magnetic reality and 900 miles of identical white nothingness. 4. Betting that fur coats were overrated, a group of would-be adventurers boarded their ship wearing fashionable European tailoring that would have been impressive at a winter gala, but was catastrophically useless against Arctic wind that behaves like a tax audit for your soul. They brought a tailor along instead of a survival expert, assuming that looking sophisticated would somehow intimidate the climate into behaving. Within days, they discovered that silk-lined waistcoats transform into refrigerated regret at sub-zero temperatures, and their meticulously polished boots cracked apart like brittle pastries. Their diaries include phrases such as unexpected chill and persistent coldness, which is historian language for everyone was dangerously frozen and furious. By the time they limped home, wrapped in improvised blankets that resembled defeated burritos, they had unintentionally proven a scientific constant. The Arctic does not care about your wardrobe, and elegance is not a defense strategy against weather that vaporizes vanity on contact. 5. Attempting to revolutionize exploration through minimalist travel, one expedition packed only the essentials, which apparently meant tea leaves, porcelain cups, and a collapsible dining table, but somehow excluded extra fuel, emergency shelter, or anything designed to prevent hypothermia. The commander insisted that a clean camp setup would inspire discipline, but the only thing it inspired was non-stop shivering as the crew discovered that delicately sipping hot beverages in a whiteout is less charming than fatal. Their food froze into architectural sculptures, the table snapped in half during a gust strong enough to rearrange their personalities, and their tea leaves scattered across the ice like a ceremonial confession of incompetence. By the time rescue arrived, Their attempt at minimalist prestige had devolved into a chaotic cluster of half-buried porcelain and men loudly reconsidering every life choice that led them somewhere colder than their family's approval. 6. Arriving with the belief that sled dogs were too unpredictable, one overconfident team replaced them with a fleet of imported goats, declaring the animals reliable, hardy, and easy to manage, an opinion shared by no one with even baseline knowledge of zoology. The goats immediately rebelled against the concept of snow travel, refusing to pull sleds, eating essential rope, and treating tents like edible suggestions. Whenever the temperature dropped, the animals simply sat down and glared at the humans as if demanding to be taken home immediately. Meanwhile, the crew stubbornly argued that the goats merely required team building, a phrase that grew increasingly laughable as their supplies dwindled and the goats attempted escape at every opportunity. After a week of absolute chaos, the expedition finally admitted defeat, completely outmaneuvered by creatures better suited for hillsides than hellish ice deserts, providing definitive proof that the Arctic does not accept payment in misplaced confidence or barnyard optimism. 7. Marching into the Arctic with a printing press, an expedition planned to produce a daily newspaper chronicling their inevitable triumph, apparently assuming ink wouldn't freeze and paper wouldn't turn into crisp, wind-powered shrapnel. They dedicated precious cargo space to type blocks and press components, leaving minimal room for firewood, which they labeled a secondary necessity. Morale plummeted the moment they realized the press couldn't function in temperatures where steel behaves like brittle crackers, and their proudly written headlines, things like "Progress expected soon," blew into the abyss the moment any tent flap opened. The crew soon discovered that frostbite makes typing less than ideal, and that running a newspaper in the Arctic is roughly as practical as opening a lemonade stand on the moon. By the time they returned home, their only remaining publication was a single frozen sheet summarizing the entire expedition. Complete miscalculation, details withheld. 8. Convinced that polar bears were mostly polite if treated respectfully, one expedition approached the Arctic's apex predators with the same confidence someone might use when negotiating with a mildly disgruntled house cat. The leader insisted that bears could sense positive intentions, which turned out to be wildly incorrect the moment one of the creatures approached their camp with an expression best described as culinary curiosity. Instead of building proper defenses, the men attempted to coexist, leaving meat scraps as offerings, essentially opening a buffet with themselves as the dessert course. Unsurprisingly, the bears interpreted this as a welcome invitation, and the crew spent most nights scrambling up improvised towers of crates, contemplating the life choices that led to becoming appetizers. By the time they evacuated, several tents were flattened, rations were devoured, and the bears had developed a comfortable daily routine, proving that goodwill diplomacy does not apply to animals that weigh more than a piano. 9. Declaring that Arctic silence would sharpen mental clarity, an ambitious expedition imposed a strict no-talking policy to foster focus, turning their journey into a frozen, silent retreat with far worse outcomes and significantly higher frostbite. The rule prevented anyone from reporting problems aloud, so minor issues, like cracking ice, malfunctioning stoves, or the small detail of drifting off course by several hundred miles, went unmentioned as men pantomimed urgently in temperatures that froze their facial expressions into permanent masks of regret. As morale collapsed, the commander insisted the silence was part of the journey, despite the fact that half the crew was silently plotting mutiny. Eventually, the no-talking rule broke when a man finally shouted after falling through a snow crust, which the leader labeled disappointing, as though nearly dying were merely a breach of etiquette. The expedition ended early, proving communication isn't optional when wandering through a landscape designed to erase any sign you were ever there. 10. Treating the Arctic like a scenic backdrop for luxury living, one wealthy sponsor outfitted an expedition with velvet-lined tents, carved wooden furniture, and a portable chandelier described as essential ambiance, transforming their camp into the world's coldest boutique hotel. Unfortunately, none of these lavish additions had the slightest resistance to wind capable of lifting furniture like judgmental poltergeists. Their ornate tent collapsed under its own decorative weight. The chandelier froze to the point where touching it felt like communing with a vengeful glacier, and the men discovered velvet behaves like a damp, icy curse when exposed to snow. While they struggled to maintain their Arctic Versailles, their rations dwindled and their morale plummeted, prompting the crew to eventually abandon the entire setup like a failed pop-up restaurant. The only thing left standing was a single frozen armchair, gazing across the wilderness like a monument to the world's least practical interior design. 11. Determined to outrun winter itself, an expedition attempted to chase the changing seasons by racing north faster than the weather could freeze them, a plan that assumed the Arctic was some kind of punctual office worker rather than a relentless force arriving whenever it pleases. Their calculations, based on optimistic almanac notes and an unwavering belief in speed, collapsed the moment their ship became encased in ice, as though the climate had decided to personally ruin their thesis. The crew spent months stranded in their frozen vessel, debating whether their leader's plan was bold innovation or an elaborate misunderstanding of how time works. Supplies dwindled, morale fractured, and the ice mocked them with every groaning shift. When thaw finally came, the men sailed home quietly, avoiding questions about how they planned to outrun a season that literally blankets half the planet, leaving behind a cautionary tale about treating nature like a competitor in a race it never agreed to join. 12. Confident that exotic spices would enhance the Arctic dining experience, one team packed crates of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg while forgetting practical items like extra fuel or functional mittens. The crew optimistically declared they would feast like kings, but ended up sprinkling cinnamon on frozen hardtack while trying not to lose fingers opening spice jars that had fused shut. Their cook attempted to create elaborate dishes using snow, dwindling rations, and wishful thinking, resulting in meals that tasted like flavorful despair. Morale briefly lifted when someone managed to thaw enough water to make spiced tea, only for the pot to crack in half during a sudden temperature drop that sounded like the universe laughing. By spring, rescue arrived to find men surrounded by shattered cookware, half-empty spice crates, and the unmistakable look of people who had learned the hard way that gourmet ambition is useless in a climate that considers boiling water a personal challenge. 13. Arguing that maps were too restrictive, a group of explorers committed to finding a more organic route, which is a poetic way of saying they wandered aimlessly into the Arctic with all the confidence of a GPS signal standing on one foot. They believed intuition, clouds, and the shape of the wind would guide them, which resulted in a predictable disaster as they drifted hundreds of miles off course, convinced they were nearing their destination every time they spotted a uniquely shaped snowdrift, which shockingly looked exactly like the previous uniquely shaped snowdrift. Whenever doubts arose, the leader insisted that navigation is a feeling, a phrase that future historians now categorize under catastrophic optimism. After months of looping across identical terrain, a rescue crew located them by following their tragically hopeful trail of improvised landmarks, mostly sticks stuck in snow, silently documenting an expedition that proved vibes-based navigation is slightly less effective than doing nothing at all. 14. Convinced wind could be harnessed for motivation, an expedition embarked with massive banners intended to flutter majestically and inspire courage, only to discover that Arctic gusts do not flutter. They obliterate. Moments after hoisting their first banner, the wind ripped it away like a bored deity snatching a toy, and subsequent attempts ended with shredded fabric flailing violently as if auditioning for a horror movie. The crew spent valuable time trying to rescue these tattered motivational symbols while ignoring more pressing matters like shelter stability or the fact that icicles were forming inside their lunch barrels. The leader remained bizarrely committed, claiming the banner's destruction symbolized the struggle toward greatness, a poetic interpretation that did nothing to warm anyone's extremities. When they finally retreated, the ice fields were littered with scraps of inspirational fabric, gently reminding future travelers that the Arctic does not support morale art installations and prefers to be admired from afar, silently and without decoration. 15. Treating the concept of teamwork like an optional bonus, one crew divided into specialized units based on personality: optimists, pessimists, strategists, and a group labeled general enthusiasm, assuming this quirky division would create balance rather than total meltdown. Instead, the optimists insisted everything was fine, even as the ice cracked beneath them. The pessimists declared doom every morning before breakfast. The strategists couldn't agree on a plan without holding 5-hour discussions that froze halfway through, and the enthusiasm squad attempted to start pep chants that immediately died in the wind. Decisions stalled, tempers froze as quickly as their equipment, and the group maintained precisely zero cohesion as each faction blamed the others for conditions that were, objectively, everyone's fault. By the time they returned, the only lesson learned was that personality-based logistics collapse under pressure, especially when the pressure is an average temperature that could extinguish hope faster than the pessimists anticipated. 16. Announcing that ice behaves logically if you respect it. An ambitious expedition built their winter camp on what they believed was solid ground, only to discover, through the universal language of cracking noises, that they were living on a drifting ice floe roughly the size of a confused dinner plate. Instead of relocating immediately, the leader declared the movement a minor geographical shuffle, which sounded much less reassuring once the camp began rotating slowly in open water like a tragic theme park ride. The men spent nights listening to the ice groan beneath them, as if contemplating whether to keep supporting their bad decisions or just end the suspense. And every morning they awoke a little farther from where they'd intended to be, drifting deeper into territory that wasn't on any map. By the time rescue arrived, the entire group looked like people who had learned, intimately, that the Arctic does not accept respect as valid currency when deciding whether or not to swallow your campsite whole. 17. Treating scientific instruments as optional decor, one expedition brought along a single barometer they handled like a sacred relic, convinced it could predict every possible danger in the Arctic, despite nobody fully understanding how it worked. Whenever the needle twitched slightly, the crew interpreted it as anything from an incoming blizzard to a divine warning and spent hours debating what the barometer felt. Meanwhile, actual weather rolled in with the subtlety of a wrecking ball, catching them completely unprepared because they were too busy philosophizing over a device that had already frozen solid. The leader insisted they continue consulting it, even after it shattered during a temperature drop so violent it could have cracked their ambitions as well. By journey's end, the men regarded the barometer as a tragic symbol of their misplaced confidence, a reminder that a fancy tool is useless if everyone treats it like a mystical personality test instead of an actual survival instrument. 18. Attempting a full-blown Arctic cultural outreach, another well-meaning but profoundly misguided expedition arrived carrying trunks of ornate gifts, velvet coats, musical trinkets, and decorative porcelain, hoping to forge friendships with the locals, apparently unaware that the region's only permanent residents were animals with zero interest in diplomacy. The men arranged their gifts ceremoniously atop snowbanks, waiting proudly for grateful recipients who did not exist, unless you count the foxes that promptly stole a set of embroidered gloves. Undeterred, the commander insisted they continue their goodwill mission, which devolved into watching the wind demolish their offerings one expensive object at a time. Months later, the crew returned home reporting that their cultural exchange was met with stoic silence, a polite way of admitting the Arctic took their gifts, shredded them, buried them, or let predators drag them into oblivion, making it the world's least appreciative pen pal. 19. Declaring that fire was too primitive, one inventor-led expedition attempted to heat their shelters using an experimental chemical device described as clean, modern innovation, which is always a phrase that guarantees disaster. The contraption relied on delicate tubes, precise conditions, and the kind of blind optimism normally reserved for startup pitches, and predictably it malfunctioned the instant temperatures dropped below freezing. Instead of producing warmth, the device sputtered out sad puffs of steam and occasionally emitted noises that suggested it was reconsidering its purpose in life, leaving the men huddled around what amounted to an over-engineered teapot, having an existential crisis. As frost crept into every corner of their camp, the leader insisted they simply needed to trust the process, a strategy that worked about as well as trusting a snowman to guard your valuables. Eventually, they abandoned the device and built a traditional fire, proving that innovation is lovely until the weather demands heat, not theory. 20. Treating wildlife photography like a spiritual calling, one expedition hauled dozens of heavy cameras into the Arctic, each requiring delicate handling, careful exposure, and weather conditions that absolutely did not exist there. They set up elaborate photo stations as if posing for a nature magazine, only to watch lenses crack like sugar glass the moment the wind showed any enthusiasm. The shutter mechanisms froze, film snapped, and one unfortunate camera simply exploded into pieces after a gust turned it into a clattering metal icicle. Still, the leader insisted they had a responsibility to capture the essence of the region, which apparently meant documenting their own increasing misery as their equipment failed spectacularly. By the end, the crew had precisely 3 blurry photographs, one of a boot, one of a snow mound, and one of a man grimacing so hard his face looked geometrically incorrect, perfectly encapsulating their journey, ambitious intentions buried under the crushing reality of physics. 21. Announcing their plan to build the first Arctic garden, one crew arrived with sacks of soil, seeds, and an inexplicable optimism about sunlight that definitely did not exist in the quantities they needed. They planted rows of hopeful little sprouts in the frozen wasteland, covering them lovingly with canvas warmers as if they were nurturing delicate dreams instead of guaranteeing botanical tragedy. The seeds refused to germinate, the soil froze into a single murderous brick, and the men insisted on watering their non-existent seedlings until the watering cans themselves froze solid, possibly out of sympathy. As days passed with no sign of life except the crew's increasingly deranged determination, the leader announced that progress may be subtle, a phrase that began sounding suspiciously like denial. Eventually, the expedition abandoned their frozen farm, leaving behind the saddest garden plot in recorded history, a perfect agricultural monument to the enduring power of misplaced hope. 22. Attempting to improve morale through structured recreation, one team insisted on holding nightly card tournaments despite the minor obstacle that their deck kept freezing into a single, immovable slab, effectively transforming poker night into a shared exercise in futility. The men tried thawing the cards near lanterns, which worked briefly before the heat warped every face into eerie abstract art, making it impossible to tell whether someone was holding a queen, a four, or a psychological cry for help. Still, the commander insisted that games were crucial for team cohesion, even though each session devolved into men squinting at frostbitten cardboard, arguing over rules no one could remember, and occasionally attempting to shuffle the unshuffleable. By the end of the expedition, the cards resembled a stack of bent, frozen potato chips, and morale was roughly the same temperature, proving that group bonding becomes complicated when your recreational equipment is as brittle as your patience. 23. Armed with the belief that a positive attitude influences climate, one dangerously cheerful leader marched his team north while delivering motivational speeches about sunshine and destiny, which the Arctic greeted by promptly delivering a whiteout so thick the men couldn't see their own regret. Still, the leader insisted that their good vibes would shift the energy, a statement disproven by the universe within minutes. As the wind howled loud enough to rattle bones, he continued giving pep talks that froze mid-air into useless icicles of optimism, while the crew slowly realized that inspiration does not, in fact, warm exposed skin. Food froze instantly, tents bent into sad origami sculptures, and morale cratered as the commander kept telling them to manifest warmth, a sentiment that produced exactly 0 degrees of improvement. When the storm finally passed, the crew's only manifestation was the overwhelming desire to go home immediately. 24. Deciding that reindeer could function as multi-use vehicles, one expedition attempted to employ the animals as transport, guards, and morale mascots, apparently assuming they were snowy superhero creatures instead of temperamental herbivores with opinions. The men tried to saddle them like horses, hitch them like sled dogs, and even position them as lookout sentries, none of which the reindeer tolerated for more than 8 seconds. Within days, the animals had formed a silent union and began refusing all tasks, walking away at the exact moment they were needed most, sometimes dragging half the camp with them out of sheer pettiness. The crew persisted with increasingly desperate ideas, training sessions, snacks, motivational speeches that absolutely did not translate, until they finally conceded defeat as their reindeer abandoned them entirely. The expedition limped home on foot while the animals watched smugly from a nearby ridge, fully aware they had won the world's coldest labor dispute. 25. Fueled by the desire to study Arctic acoustics, a group of scholars spent weeks hauling enormous brass horns across the ice, intending to record the mysterious sounds of shifting glaciers, only to discover that their equipment froze instantly and produced nothing but faint wheezes reminiscent of asthmatic whales. Undeterred, the scholars pressed their ears to the ice, hoping for profound revelations, but mostly hearing the internal soundtrack of their own disappointment. When temperatures dropped further, the horns fused to the snow like giant metallic regrets, forcing the team to pry them loose using tools that immediately froze to their hands. Despite spending weeks chasing a single usable sound, the only recorded audio was a distant crunch made by one scholar accidentally stepping on his own equipment, which the team later labeled a rare glacial whisper. By the expedition's end, they had contributed precisely nothing to science except the lesson that curiosity is not improved by frostbite. 26. Treating the Arctic like an open-air laboratory, one expedition attempted to test various experimental medicines, most of which froze into useless blocks before anyone could ingest them. The researchers insisted their concoctions could cure frostbite, fatigue, and possibly boredom. But the cold had other plans, turning their bottles into multicolored ice sculptures and their test subjects into deeply skeptical participants. On particularly frigid days, one medicine bottle shattered spontaneously in what could only be described as an emotional outburst, sending frozen shards across the tent and convincing the team that their experiment might actually be trying to escape. The researchers dutifully recorded each failure, calling them unexpected outcomes, the scientific equivalent of shrugging while your ambitions frost over. By the journey's end, the expedition had proven one thing conclusively: the Arctic is not interested in your pharmaceutical hopes and will happily convert them into colorful debris. 27. Inspired by tales of silent northern nights, one crew packed an entire set of delicate musical bells meant to create an ethereal soundscape, a poetic concept that immediately evaporated once the temperature plunged and the bells fused into one solid lump that clanged like a dropped frying pan whenever anyone moved it. Undeterred, the commander insisted they continue their nightly bell rituals, which mostly consisted of men shaking a frozen metal blob that emitted noises guaranteed to attract exactly zero spiritual enlightenment. Worse, on windy nights, the blob vibrated ominously, producing a low hum that convinced half the crew the expedition was haunted by an annoyed glacier. After weeks of sonic misery, the crew dumped the metal mass into the snow, where it promptly sank like a guilty conscience. The Arctic remained acoustically unchanged, proving once again that nature does not require human attempts at mystical musical enhancement. 28. Astonished that the Arctic lacked convenient signage, one expedition erected handmade direction markers across the ice, proudly planting tall wooden arrows labeled with things like camp, ship, and please no more snow, which the wind immediately interpreted as toys to fling across the horizon. The markers fell, snapped, and cartwheeled into oblivion faster than the men could rebuild them, and several times the arrows ended up pointing directly opposite their intended directions, creating an accidental labyrinth of misleading instructions. Still, the commander insisted on maintaining a clearly marked territory, resulting in hours of labor each day constructing signs that vanished within minutes. By the end of the journey, the only functioning navigation system was instinct mixed with desperation, while their carefully crafted signage formed a scattered museum of futility across the ice, silently reminding future explorers that if nature wanted road signs, it would have invented them first. 29. Deciding that mental stimulation prevents hypothermia, one unusually educationally enthusiastic expedition brought along crates of heavy books, which immediately froze into unreadable bricks of literary disappointment. The men tried to pry them open, only to discover that pages shatter under extreme cold like philosophical potato chips, sending shards of frozen text fluttering through the air like sad confetti. Still, they insisted on holding nightly reading sessions, which devolved into reciting whichever fragments they could salvage from the ice, creating stories that made less sense every day. One particularly determined scholar attempted to thaw a volume near a stove, creating the world's first steaming novel before the book collapsed into mushy sludge. Eventually, the crew accepted that education might have to wait until they returned to temperatures where words remain attached to paper, leaving behind a scattered trail of shattered sentences and unrealized intellectual ambition. 30. Confident that the key to success was extreme discipline, one leader forced his men into a rigid daily schedule that made boot camp look like a spa retreat, complete with timed marches, formal meal procedures, and mandatory motivational recitations, all while the Arctic wind personally attempted to erode their soul. The routine quickly proved impossible, as cooking fires refused to ignite on command, tents collapsed during inspection hours, and frostbite disrupted their perfectly allotted break times. Whenever the schedule failed, the leader blamed lack of dedication, a statement met with silent stares from men whose eyelashes were literally freezing together. Morale shattered faster than their utensils, and the daily recitations became muttered curses creatively directed at both the wind and the commander. By the time the expedition ended, the schedule was nothing but a soggy, frozen notebook of unrealistic expectations, and the crew had unanimously agreed never to time manage nature again. 31. Attempting to create the most efficient Arctic diet, one expedition rationed food with mathematical precision, assigning each man a meticulously weighed portion that resembled a sad museum exhibit on starvation. They believed careful calorie control would sustain them for months, failing to consider that surviving temperatures capable of freezing breath midair requires more fuel than a sparrow on a juice cleanse. Within weeks, the crew grew delirious from hunger, staring resentfully at glaciers as though they might spontaneously turn into roast meat, while the leader insisted they must trust the numbers, even though the numbers clearly hated them. Men began bartering imaginary snacks, debating whether frost has a flavor, and discussing the ethics of eating their notebooks. When they finally abandoned the diet and raided emergency supplies, the resulting meal lasted 7 glorious minutes before everything froze again, perfectly encapsulating the delicate balance between science, hunger, and reality's refusal to cooperate. After all that Arctic genius on ice, it's a miracle humanity made it past mittens. Drop your vote for the dumbest disaster below, and stick around. The stupidity only gets colder from here.